Welcome back. This is week 2 of the course, and I am already downgrading to wearing a sweatshirt. Actually, technically, I have a nicer shirt on underneath, but it's cold in here. I'm not recording at home. Recording at home would mean trying to be heard over the sound of 2 very small children running around a small apartment playing. Lockdown means can't really take them to a playground or the library, so we're sort of down to our apartment, my parents' home, or just somewhere outside around the complex. Tricky. So anyway, here we are with our white cabinets and my sweatshirt. Today's quick lecture is going to be dealing with the question that you probably asked yourself when watching the last lecture on the poet Du Fu, which is, that's great, we get that he's amazing in Chinese, but most of us don't read Chinese. I think there are a couple of Chinese students on the roll for this course, and they probably have really enjoyed reading Du Fu in Chinese. The rest of you in English are probably, wondering, how are we supposed to enjoy this in English? So we're going to kind of get at that today a little bit. It's always an open question. How do we appreciate what's going on here in our language? Now, of course, the first answer to that is, in the best kind of poetry, even in translation, there's something about it that will probably get you somewhere. But if you're not used to it, any kind of poetry needs a little bit of an on-ramp. So today is going to be serving as a sort of on-ramp for Du Fu. So let's get into it. There are a lot of ways to go at the question of how to appreciate Du Fu not in Chinese. Music, art, etc. all have interesting analogs, but those would require a lot more interaction than we're capable of right now. So let's go with one that maybe is a little more direct, and that's Du Fu's influence on other poetic traditions besides the Chinese. We're going to be looking at the U.S. in particular today, the 20th century. In 1902, the British sinologist Ernest Fenollosa died, and his widow, not really sure what to do with his notes and manuscripts, held on to them until she met the American poet Ezra Pound in London in 1913. Now, Pound had already been writing poetry for a while in a very different style than many other people were doing. She was impressed by it, so she gave all the writings to him. Pound was floored. Now, Pound knew nothing about Chinese. He didn't speak the language, didn't read it, hadn't read much history. He was completely unschooled in any of this, and despite that fact, Fenollosa's widow gave him the writings, and he thought he had found in them exactly what he'd been looking for as a way forward for poetry. Now, the resulting volume that he put together was called Cathay and was published in 1915. It was only vaguely a translation. The image you see behind you is a page, the front page from the work, and just reading the description of what it is by Pound himself. For the most part, and whenever you start anything by saying, for the most part, you know there's going to be some problems about its integrity, right? So if I say, for the most part, what you're eating today is brownies, well, then what part of this isn't brownies, right? So for the most part, from the Chinese, all right, of rihaku, which is not a Chinese word, it's a Japanese word, from the notes, okay, so not even Ezra Pound's notes, of the late Ernest Fenollosa, and the decipherings of the professors Mori and Ariga, who were Japanese scholars, colleagues of Fenollosa's. So, not even fully, but for the most part, from the Chinese, of the Japanese, by the notes of someone else, and deciphered by people who weren't Chinese, but who read Chinese very well. Not particularly great in terms of integrity. Scholars have disagreed about this volume ever since it was put out. A lot of hardcore sinologists just wince whenever they come across it because Pound definitely did not speak Chinese well enough to get a lot of this correct. A lot of people who appreciate poetry see it a little differently. I have to jump in here with a little personal note. One of the major reasons I got into Chinese literature at all was through Pound and, as we'll see later, his friend and colleague T.S. Eliot. I had also been reading a lot of very flowery, interesting poetry, and the first time I came across, through Pound, the translation of a Chinese poem, like him, I was floored. It was beautiful, but had nothing about it that felt like poetry. It was just so simple, and yet seemingly so complex at the same time. I didn't really know what I was looking at. I would come across it later on, the first time I was in China, which was 1902. I don't think I've mentioned, but I've now lived in China altogether about 10 years. 1902 is my first time to live there. And I first read Du Fu, thanks to having been introduced to Chinese poetry by Pound, in Chinese. It's a fantastic experience. But as someone who's read a lot of Chinese now, is Pound a particularly good observer of Chinese language? He's a particularly interesting observer. I don't think he's going to tell you what the experience is exactly. But I have to throw that in there because regardless of your opinion of his sinology, Pound's presentation of Chinese literature has been hugely influential. But back to the presentation. Why did Fenollosa and Pound find Chinese poetry so influential, so impactful? A lot of it is rooted in both of their belief in the power of the quote-unquote ideagram, the Chinese character. The term ideagram being a word to describe a written form that isn't a word. Like if I say chair, the actual letters C-H-A-I-R do not in any way point to a chair. You have to have some idea of how they sound and look, and then think of a chair. Whereas according to Fenollosa and Pound, the Chinese character for chair would in some way look like a chair, and therefore point you directly to it. So according to Fenollosa, it was a writing system that you couldn't corrupt or turn into obscure, impossible to understand writing, because no matter how obscure you tried to make it, someone would look at the character of a chair and see a chair. You couldn't make it sound like something else. This was their favorite example. It's the Chinese character xin, which, if you're going to translate it into one word, would be either trust or believe. It's composed of two parts. The left-hand part is a downward angling diagonal stroke. Under that is a vertical line. Right next to that is another dash, followed by 3 horizontal lines and a square. So the two parts, the left-hand part, if you put it a little on its side, is the Chinese word for person or human being. The central portion with all the other strokes generally refers to word or speech. So for Fenollosa and Pound, and for a lot of people since, the character means a person standing by their word. And for Fenollosa, that would mean, look, no matter how you explain this or what you do with it, it's always going to be a person standing by their word, period. It's not going to change. Pound put it this way. In Europe, if you ask a man to define anything, his definition always moves away from the simple things that he knows perfectly well. It recedes into an unknown region, that is a region of remoter and progressively remoter abstraction. The Chinese still use abbreviated pictures as pictures. That is to say, Chinese ideagram does not try to be the picture of a sound, or to be a written sign recalling a sound, but it is still the picture of a thing. It means the thing or the action or the situation. So, English has a lot of words to describe a lot of things. For Pound, there's only one character that means a thing, and it is visually connected to that thing. So there's no need to abstract, because the character is already the thing itself in some way. If you'll recall, when we were looking at the Du Fu poem for our last lecture, I read the English followed by the Chinese. The Chinese is much, much more concise, and for Pound, that was part of the point. You didn't need a lot of words, because the objects were already there in front of your eyes. He also had this to say to his fellow poets shortly before encountering the Chinese through Fenollosa. Use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. Don't use such an expression as dim lands of peace. It dulls the image. It mixes abstraction with the concrete. It comes from the writers not realizing that the natural object is always the adequate symbol. Right? So, in other words, if you find a flower beautiful, if you find a rose beautiful, you don't then need to think of 15 different adjectives to extol the beauty of the rose, because people already appreciate a rose. Now, you might say the rose is drifting on the water, the rose is falling from a bush. However you put it, you can do that. But you don't need to make the rose more than it is. The natural object is always the adequate symbol. Now, let's look at a couple of examples of how this works. This is a poem by the Victorian English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, mid to late 19th century, as an example of what Ezra Pound is not talking about. So this is from Crossing the Bar. Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea, but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. First of all, not just what is this poem about, but where are the objects? We've got sunset and evening star, okay. But all the images in the poem tend to point away from each other, right? So we've got sunset and evening star, but the poet isn't looking at them. They're just a reference for something else. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. So sea's an image, but we're not talking about the sea. He's just mentioning it in passing. Everything else seems to be adrift. If I asked you what is this poem about, you would probably say, I truly have no clue what this poem is about. Pound would say that's exactly the point. The moment we forget that the natural object is always the adequate symbol, we end up with a poem which, all right, sounds great, but it's going to direct people in other places they don't want to go. Now, here is, by contrast, Moonlit Night by Du Fu. This is David Hawkes' translation, which personally I very much prefer to Stephen Owen's. If you ever want, you can ask me why, but I don't think Owen's translation of this is particularly good. David Hawkes translates it this way. Tonight in Fuzhou, my wife will be watching the moon alone. I think with tenderness of my faraway little ones, too young to understand about their father in Chang'an. My wife's soft hair must be wet from the scented night mist, and her white arms chilled by the cold moonlight. When shall we lean on the open casement together and gaze at the moon until the tears on our cheeks are dry? Whether you understand anything about the Anlushan rebellion or not, this is not a difficult poem to access. The first line alone, tonight in Fuzhou, my wife will be watching the moon alone. The moon is an almost universal symbol of melancholy. In Chinese culture and in Western culture, if someone is watching the moon alone, it is a sad image. Even if the person is somewhat happy, the situation is not. And for someone like Pound, this is a stunning piece of poetry. According to, it could be a true story. I think it's a good story, one way or the other. An apocryphal story anyway. When Pound was meeting with a fellow poet's family, the fellow poet's family was a farmer or some sort of manual laborer, and trying to impress him, Pound decided to read him a poem he'd written. And the friend's father said, well, I don't understand what that means. And Pound went into explaining exactly what it means, and this word means this, and this line means this. And the friend's father said, well, why didn't you just say that? And Pound thought, right, why didn't I just say that? Well, Du Fu is just saying that, and yet there is still something elusive about this. There's no flowery adjectives, but the scenario and the way he goes about it is still something that you have to think about. I couldn't resist another personal interlude here. One of the truly incredible things about classical Chinese poetry is how accessible and inaccessible it is at the same time. What I mean by that is that anyone can read it and enjoy it on some level. The images are simple. There's the moon, there's a window, there's sadness at being separated. It's simple enough, and this is true, that classical poetry like this is taught to children in Chinese schools. In fact, the first time I ever read Du Fu in Chinese was, I believe, in 1902. Not quite that old. 2002. The first time I lived in China, my neighbor across the hall was an old retired professor of horse breeding. It was an agricultural university. Is interesting. Anyway, he was the one who taught me how to read Chinese characters, and the text he used to teach me about them was his granddaughter's, we would think of it as first or second grade reader. And in the second grade reader, there was a poem by Du Fu. Why? The rhyme and meter are very simple. It's very short. It's not hard to follow. The characters flow like this. So even a child can memorize it, but scholars still spend half their lives studying it and writing about it. I don't know any other poetry that does that. It's utterly fascinating to me. Now, you've seen Tennyson, you've seen Du Fu. Here is one of Pound's efforts at a very simple poem. Actually, he's emulating a haiku, but the haiku form, the Japanese haiku form, is rooted in Chinese poetry. It's called In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Now, of course, we could quibble about this and say, well, why does he have to say apparition? Why are they faces or petals and not just faces, etc.? But this is an attempt at simplifying the image and not having a lot of extraneous words. Now, of course, if you read a lot of Pound's other poems, you can be forgiven for thinking it's definitely departing from this. Pound wasn't necessarily trying to write exactly like someone like Du Fu. He was trying to take the central idea of these poems and apply them a little more broadly to the tradition and say, okay, well, why don't we just stop focusing on all the philosophy and flowery ideas and just get right down to the thing itself. Now, this is an interesting sort of reference, but perhaps the most dramatic influence on this is on one of the 20th century's greatest literary works, which is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Now, T.S. Eliot was putting this together at about the time that Ezra Pound was really getting deeply into Chinese poetry. And the two of them talked a lot, and Eliot sent him manuscripts of The Wasteland. And one of the most fascinating things, well, at least fascinating for me, for a literary nerd, is to look at Eliot's original manuscripts and see what Ezra Pound did to them. So Eliot sent him manuscripts that were hundreds of pages long, and Ezra Pound just tore them to pieces. He would literally cut dozens of pages out of it. The final version of The Wasteland is very, very short when you compare it to where we started from. Much, much longer. And in fact, Eliot was so thankful to Pound's intervention that the opening epigraph of the work simply says, I can't quote the Italian, partially because I don't speak Italian, but he wrote in Italian, to Ezra Pound, the superior craftsman. And this is how The Wasteland opens up. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. This is a fascinating way to begin a modernist work, at the time would have been very avant-garde and weird and experimental. Partially because there appears to be a kind of structure here. The end of 3 lines, there's a present continuous verb, breeding, mixing, stirring, followed by what we would think of as just a simple thought. It almost reads like a haiku or a very simple Chinese poem, right? Breeding lilacs out of the dead land. Now, dead land might be a little obscure. Lilacs, not obscure. Dull roots with spring rain, very simple image. Feeding a little life with dried tubers, also not hard to see or think about. He's pointing us to objects, and in a way that at least Eliot and Pound were hoping was fairly straightforward, right? And there's lots of things we could do with analyzing this. We won't get into it because we don't have time. But the idea, the feel of it was meant to be like a Chinese poem. It was meant to be something that was both simple and elusive, right? When you've got the earth covered in forgetful snow, to be fair, forgetful snow is a little obscure, but the idea of earth being covered in snow like a blanket and being warm, these images are perhaps not universal, but certainly not that obscure. They're not hard to follow. And the phrasing generally steers away from lots of flowery abstraction, right? Compare that, for example, to this one. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Compared to that, dull roots with spring rain is practically boring, right? But of course the point was simply to point us to the object simply, or as simply as possible. I'll just conclude here by saying I do hope you enjoy Du Fu. Poetry tends to be in classrooms sort of just overwrought. What does this word symbolize? I know it says bicycle, but couldn't that be the downfall of society? Something like that. If you want to play that game, go ahead. But the poetry of Du Fu is meant to point us out to the idea that poetry is something that everyone should be able to access. Not on the same grounds, not in the same way, but in a way that is meaningful. So if you find yourself reading Du Fu and just seeing a single line that makes you go, wow, you don't need to explore it much. I would argue that Du Fu probably didn't intend you to do that, right? You can study the historical references if you want, but I would encourage you to simply appreciate the lines for what they are. And if you want to ask questions, ask lots of questions. And if not, simply enjoy the image of the moon.